Hello, everybody. Welcome to Patriot's History. I'm Larry Schweikart, co-author of Patriot's History with Michael Allen, and your host for this show where I read through Patriot's History. This is brought to you by the Wild World of History. Make sure you check it out if you're an educator of high schoolers or a homeschooler. We offer a full U.S. history curriculum tied to Patriot's History of the United States with teacher's guides, student guides, tests, maps, and me teaching all 22 chapters in videos of 45 minutes to an hour. So you'll want to check that out. We also have a full world history class available with 15 videos, same everything, including 15 videos taught by me and 15 lesson plans, all the rest of that, okay? So check that out. There's tons of free stuff at the Wild World of History for students, all sorts of vignettes on UFOs in history and the Crusades and knights in shining armor and just all sorts of historical stuff. The worst seagoing disaster in American history, which occurred on the Mississippi River. Anyway, tons of free stuff there. Check it out. All right, let's get started. We are reading from the 15th anniversary edition. Now, if you've got an earlier edition, the page numbers may not quite jibe at times, and the further back you go, the worse it's going to get, because we had to eliminate a lot of stuff, including the Rush Limbaugh interview that was done with me for the Limbaugh letter in 2004 that he graciously allowed us to publish in the first paperback version of the book. But we had to take it out later because we needed the room. I mean, it's crazy how history keeps moving. Did you know that? History just keeps going and adding stuff to our lives. So anyway, so try to use the 15th anniversary edition. And I'm on page 72 of the 15th anniversary edition in chapter 2, Colonies No More. Now, we left off last time, and I'm just about to discuss a document with you. And you'll note throughout Patriot's history, there are documents, prompts, where we will say, here's where you use X document. I don't expect someone teaching the class with our curriculum to use all the documents in the Patriot's history reader. I think we have 65, 70, something like that. Can't use all those, do a deep dive into them, and stay anywhere near on schedule to get the class done. So I recommend you do 4 or 5 a semester. But since I'm reading this and we have the time, I'm going to read through the documents as I get to them. So this is for chapter 3, The Rights of the Colonists by Samuel Adams in 1772. And his paper argued that colonists as men, Christians, and subjects had been ordained by God with certain rights. Now, where does he get this? Adams gets this from a long history of English political thought, beginning with Thomas Hobbes. Thomas Hobbes was a monarchist. He thought that you needed to have a strong central government to operate. And he wrote a book called The Leviathan, named after the biblical sea beast. But what's really important about Hobbes is he's the first of the authors to start off with the concept of natural rights. And Hobbes says, way back when, in a galaxy far, far away, right? The Star Wars thing, a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. Way back when, life among men was very unpleasant. He said it was, quote, a war of man against every other man. And Hobbes said that life at that time was solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Now, either that's a law firm or ladies, I'm sure you've dated guys that were like that, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. But what Hobbes got to was this, that everyone has a right to life. Are you ready for this? The whole right to life concept comes from Thomas Hobbes. And in justifying a big government, Hobbes said men would do anything to protect their right to life. So men were born into this really rotten state, and they instituted government to protect their right to life. All right, now notice something. As we said in the first lessons, talking about American exceptionalism and the 4 pillars of American exceptionalism, government, as we're going to see from Thomas Jefferson, government is not instituted among men. That's what he says. But if you go further, he already says that these rights are in place and that you have to have a government. Jefferson's going to argue that if you rebel and overthrow a government, you got to put a new government in place. So, Tom, if you have to have a government, it's natural, right? But you're going to get this theme recurring for a little bit. The government is artificial. Now, that's not what the Greeks believed. The Greeks believed, Aristotle, Plato, they all believed government was entirely natural. In fact, they believed that government was man's nature to form a polis, a governing body, and that man's telos, his purpose, his reason for being, was to be a political creature, to engage in government. Okay. So Hobbes picks this up, and Hobbes says life was horrible. It was a war of man against every other man. Life was solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. To get out of that state of nature, that's what he called the state of nature, war of man against every other man. To get out of that state of nature, which is bad, Hobbes said men created government to protect their right to life, and that they would or could, were legitimately able to give up anything else, right to property, right to pursuit of happiness, anything else, so long as the government protected your right to life. Now, just think about that in the context of the recent meaning, 2 or 3, 4 years ago, vaccine lockdowns, right? This was Hobbesianism in action. This was Hobbes saying, we got to protect you from the pandemic, so we're going to lock you down, take away your business, take away your right to earn a living, take away your kids' right to go to school, whatever. All that goes by the by because we're protecting your life. We're saving you from the China virus. So next time you hear a discussion of the lockdowns, think Hobbes, Hobbes, Thomas Hobbes. That's 100% Hobbesianism. But another Englishman, John Locke, comes along. And Locke agrees to the state of nature that Hobbes created, that he said existed. He agrees with that. He says, yep, that existed. But it was good. In Locke's version, the state of nature was wonderful. I mean, think puppies and butterflies. It's just beautiful. Everything's just hunky-dory. But you got out of the state of nature when people started taking other people's property. And so for Locke, the key to getting back to the state of nature, Hobbes wanted out of the state of nature, Locke wants to go back to the state of nature. And he said the key to that was to have a right to property, to protect people's property. See where this is going? already between Hobbes and Locke, we have a right to life, liberty, and Jefferson will add the phrase pursuit of happiness, by which he's going to mean property. Okay. So men needed to be free. When you took away their property, they were no longer free. We'll see that as we get much closer to the revolution, that people equate freedom with property ownership. So here's Adams, Sam Adams, who's the writer, in 1772, directed to the issues of the time, particularly England's new obsession with burdensome taxes, but they are timeless arguments. So let's begin. The Rights of the Colonies by Sam Adams, 1772. Number one, natural rights as the colonists, I'm sorry, can't even read my own book. Natural rights of the colonists as men. Natural rights of the colonists as men. Among the natural rights, notice he says among, it's not the only one. Among the natural rights of the colonists are these. First, a right to life. Where did he get that? Thomas Hobbes. Second, to liberty. Where did he get that? John Locke. Third, to property, because property is liberty and liberty is property. Together with the right to support and defend them in the best manner they can. Can you say Second Amendment? You got to be able to defend your property. You got to have a gun to defend yourself. These are evident branches of, rather than deductions from, the duty of self-preservation, commonly called the first law of nature, i.e. the right to life. So Sam Adams says that your rights all stem from this right to life, right to liberty, right to property. All men have a right to remain in a state of nature as long as they please, and in case of intolerable oppression, civil or religious, to leave the society they belong to and enter into another. When men enter into a society, it is by voluntary consent, and they have a right to demand and insist upon the performance of such conditions and previous limitations as form an equitable original compact. So you're starting to get this notion of a social contract that later Jean-Jacques Rousseau will argue that there's this agreement between the governed and the governors, and when someone breaks that agreement, it no longer holds. Every natural right, not only expressly given up or from the nature of a social compact, necessarily ceded, remains. In other words, if you don't actively give up your rights, you got them. They can't just take them from you. All positive and civil laws should conform as far as possible to the law of natural reason and equity. As neither reason requires nor religion permits the contrary, every man living in or out of the state of civil society has a right peaceably and quietly to worship God according to the dictates of his conscience. So now you got a right to religion, you got a right to worship. First Amendment. All of this is contained in documents long before the Constitution. Quote, just and true liberty, equal and impartial liberty, he says, in matters spiritual and temporal, is a thing that all men are clearly entitled to by the eternal and immutable laws of God and nature, as well as by the law of nations and all well-grounded laws which must have their foundations in the former. So this is very interesting. Sam Adams wasn't noted as a really religious guy, and yet here he is saying all of these laws come from God. Everything comes from God, including the nation's laws that we're going to apply here, and those come from God too. Isn't that remarkable? In regard to religion, mutual toleration in the different professions thereof is what all good and candid minds in all ages have ever practiced. Well, that's not exactly true. We had the Spanish Inquisition, for example. Of course, Islam didn't permit any kind of religious variations, but okay. And both by precept and example inculcated on mankind. And it is now generally agreed among Christians that this spirit of toleration, in the fullest extent consistent with being of civil society, is the chief characteristic mark of the church. So religious toleration is the chief religious mark of the church, in as much as you can. You can't let people go nuts and tolerate them to burn down your church. That doesn't work. Homie don't play that. Inasmuch that Mr. Locke has asserted and proved beyond the possibility of contradiction on any solid ground that such toleration ought to be extended to all whose doctrines are not subversive of society, what I was just saying, you can't have religious groups that say death to America. Doesn't work. The only sects which he thinks ought to be, and which by all wise laws are excluded from such toleration, are those who teach doctrines subversive of the civil government under which they live. The Roman Catholics or Papists are excluded by reason of such doctrines as these: that princes excommunicated may be deposed, and those that call heretics may be destroyed without mercy. So Adams is saying these rights shouldn't apply to Catholics because of the reasons he just mentioned. Besides, they're recognizing the Pope in so absolute a manner in subversion of government. So he's arguing that because Catholics recognize the Pope, they can't recognize a civil government. Now, over time, this has been shown not to be true. And of course, we've had a Catholic president, John F. Kennedy, who was not subservient to Rome in any way, shape, or form. The Roman Catholics or Papists is excluded by reason of such doctrines are these: that princes excommunicated may be deposed, and those that they call heretics may be destroyed without mercy. Besides, they're recognizing the Pope in so absolute a manner in subversion of government by introducing, as far as possible, into the states under whose protection they enjoy life, liberty, and property, that solecism in politics, imperium in imperio, leading directly to the worst anarchy and confusion, civil discord, war, and bloodshed. So he's saying at this time, you can't allow Catholics to have the same rights as other people. That, of course, will later be overturned. The natural liberty of man by entering into society is abridged or restrained so far only as is necessary for the great end of society, the best good of the whole. In the state of nature, every man is under God, judge and sole judge of his own rights and of the injuries done him. By entering into society, he agrees to be an arbiter or indifferent judge between him and his neighbors. So you give up some of your rights by entering into society. Remember, you can leave society anytime you want. You can go to another state of nature. But once you enter into society, you agree to give up a few of your rights so that everybody may share equal rights. But he no more renounces his original right, what I just said, than by taking a cause out of the ordinary course of law and leaving the decision to referees or indifferent arbiters. In the last case, he must pay the referees for time and trouble. He should also be willing to pay his just quota for the support of the government. So Adams says you got to pay taxes. Adams, Jefferson, none of these guys say you shouldn't pay taxes. They all say you need to pay taxes that you collectively agree on as Englishmen. He should also be willing to pay his just quota for the support of government, the law, and the Constitution, the end of which is to furnish indifferent and impartial judges in all cases that may happen, whether civil, ecclesiastical, marine, or military. So another thing that you're paying taxes for is a just court system. Do we have that today? In many parts of the country, absolutely not. There is no fair jury in DC, no fair jury in New York City, no fair jury in Austin, Texas. Can't get one. And that must be addressed, because that was in our most founding documents here, that you must have impartial juries, which we absolutely do not have now by virtue of who is living in these areas. You need to get a jury of your peers, which is basically people who look like you, act like you, talk like you, think like you. That's your peers. The natural liberty of man is to be free from any superior power on earth and not to be under the will of legislative authority of man, but only to have the law of nature for his rule. In the state of nature, men may, as the patriarchs did, employ hired servants for the defense of their lives, liberties, and properties, that is, soldiers or police. and they should pay them reasonable wages. Government was instituted for the purposes of common defense, and those who hold the reins of government have an equitable natural right to an honorable support from the same principle that, quote, the laborer is worthy of his hire. That's a phrase from the Bible, right? That Paul said a laborer is worthy of his hire. But then the same community which they serve ought to be the assessors of their pay. Governors have no right to seek and take what they please. By this, instead of being content with the station assigned them, that of honorable servants and society, they would soon become absolute masters, despots, and tyrants. Again, you have to have representative government. Hence, as a private man has a right to say what wages he will give in his private affairs, so a community to determine what they will give and grant of their substance for the administration of public affairs, and in both cases more ready to offer their service at the proposed and stipulated price than they are willing to perform their duty. In short, it is the greatest absurdity to suppose it is in the power of one or any number of men at the entering into society to renounce their natural rights or the means of preserving those rights, when the grand end of civil government, from the very nature of its institution, is for the support, protection, and defense of those rights. In other words, it's silly to think that you're entering into a compact with government that can take your rights away, when the very purpose of forming a government is to protect those rights. The principle of which, as is before observed, are life, liberty, and property. If men through fear, fraud, or mistake should in terms renounce or give up any essential natural right, the eternal law of reason and the grand end of society would absolutely vacate such renunciation. Ready for this? Adam says, you do not have the right to sell yourself into slavery because you are renouncing the natural rights that you're given by God. And you cannot renounce rights given you by God. How about that? The right to freedom, being a gift of God Almighty, is not in the power on man to alienate this gift voluntarily and become a slave. So no society has a right to vote itself into a dictatorship. Section 2, the rights of the colonists as Christians. These may be best understood by reading and carefully studying the institutes of the great lawgiver and head of the Christian church, which are to be found clearly written in the promulgated in the New Testament. He says, if you want to know about God, read what Jesus says. That's God. They're found in the New Testament, folks. He doesn't go into the New Testament, right? He says, go there. By the act of the British Parliament, commonly called the Toleration Act, every subject in England, except papists, was restored to and reestablished in his natural right to worship God according to the dictates of his own conscience. And by the charter of his province, it is granted, ordained, and established, that is declared as an original right, that there shall be liberty of conscience allowed in the worship of God to all Christians, except papists, inhabiting, or which shall inhabit or be resident within such province or territory. Magna Carta itself is in substance but a constrained declaration of the proclamation promulgation in the name of the king, lords, and commons of the sense of the latter had of their original inherent indefeasible natural rights, as also those of free citizens equally perdurable with the other. That great author, the great jurist, and even the great court writer, Mr. Justice Blackstone, holds that this recognition was justly obtained of King John, sword in hand, and peradventure it must one day, sword in hand, be rescued and preserved from total destruction and oblivion. Wow. Adam said there's going to come times where you're going to have to fight for your liberties, because it was only taken from King John, sword in hand. And he says there's going to become a future time where you're going to have sword in hand against the government. But it's interesting, and we, he's clearly got a thing against Catholics. And this is going to be overturned fairly quickly, certainly in our own Constitution. Section 3, the rights of the colonists as subjects. A commonwealth or state is a body politic or civil society of men united together to promote their mutual safety and prosperity by means of their union. The absolute rights of Englishmen and all freemen in or out of civil society are principally personal security, personal liberty, private property, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. All persons born in the British American colonies are, by the laws of God and nature and by the common law of England, exclusive of all charters from the Crown, well entitled, and by acts of the British Parliament are declared to be entitled to all natural, essential, inherent, and inseparable rights, liberties, and privileges of subjects born in Great Britain or within the realm. Long-winded, we Americans are entitled to the same rights as those in England because we are English. Britain or within the realm. Among those rights are the following, which no man or body of men consistently with their own rights as men or citizens or members of society can for themselves give up or take away from others. First, quote, the first fundamental positive law of all commonwealths or states is the establishing of the legislative power, as the first fundamental natural law also, which is to govern even the legislative power itself, is the preservation of the society. So first thing you're going to do is set up a legislature to preserve the society. Second, legislative has no right to absolute arbitrary power over the lives and fortunes of the people, nor can mortals assume a prerogative not only too high for men, but for angels, and therefore reserved for the exercise of the deity alone. You can't take God's power by taking people's rights. The legislature cannot justly assume to itself the power to rule by extempore arbitrary decrees, but is bound to see that justice is dispensed and the rights of the subjects are decided by promulgated standing and known laws and authorized independent judges. That is, independent as far as possible of prince and people. There should be one rule of justice for rich and poor, for the favorite at court, for the countryman at the plow. Again, all people created equal and treated equal before the law. Are we seeing that? What is happening to the Patriot Day J6 protesters who are being given longer sentences than murderers and rapists? Is that equal law? These are some of the first principles of natural law and justice. Third, the supreme power cannot justly take from any man any part of his property without his consent in person or by his representative. These are some of the first principles of natural law and justice and the great barriers of all free states and of the British Constitution in particular, barriers to tyrannical rule. It is utterly irreconcilable to these principles and to many other fundamental maxims of the common law, common sense, and reason that a British House of Commons should have a right at pleasure to give and grant the property of the colonists. Now, what liberty can there be where property is taken away without consent? Have they, the colonists, altogether any more weight or power to return a single member to that House of Commons who have not inadvertently but deliberately assumed a power to dispose of their lives, liberties, and properties and to choose an emperor of China? He says, we have no power. We can't send a member to Congress, to Parliament, any more than we could help elect an emperor of China. We don't have that power, he says. The inhabitants of this country, in all probability, in a few years will be more numerous than those of Great Britain, boy, was he right, and Ireland together. Yet it is absurdly expected by the promoters of the present measures that these, with their posterity to all generations, should be easy, while their property shall be disposed of by a House of Commons at 3,000 miles different from them, and who cannot be supposed to have the least care or concern for their real interests. In other words, we're going to outnumber these people very shortly, and these people 3,000 miles away are still going to be able to take our stuff without our say-so? That ain't right. To quote Chris Rock in the movie where he's a presidential candidate, that ain't right. But must be in effect bribed against it, as every burden they lay on the colonists is so much saved or gained to themselves. In other words, every tax that they put on us is helping them. So how can we trust them? They're getting rich at our expense, is what he's saying. Hitherto, many of the colonists have been free from quittance. quit rents, and I'll explain those later as we get there. But if the breath of a British House of Commons can originate an act for taking away all our money, our lands will go next, or be subject to rack rents from haughty and relentless landlords who will ride at ease while we are downtrodden in the dirt. The colonists have been branded with the odious names of traitors and rebels only for complaining of their grievances. How long such treatment will or ought to be borne is submitted. So he says, I'm asking, how long are we going to put up with this? How long should we deal with this kind of garbage? Because this is not part of the rights of Englishmen. Okay, that's a good place to stop there. We will pick up next time at page 72, right after the documents reading, and we'll continue on to the Boston Tea Party next time. Remember, this is brought to you by thewildworldofhistory.com, and if you need any kind of courses in U.S. or world history, check it out. We've got samples, including video samples, on the page. Also, remember, we're trying to turn Patriot's History of the United States into a video. Folks, I need your support. Buy me a coffee. Buy me 5 copies. I love coffee. Buy me 100 copies. And it all goes to making Patriot's History of the United States video series. And the first episode we're going to film, the pilot, is going to be Thomas Jefferson and the Barbary Pirates. So kick in some. We'd love to see. You don't have to be an investor of $10,000. You can kick in $5 or $10 or $20 and help us make this. I'll see you guys back here on Monday.